To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and I'm excited to be joined today by returning guest and dear friend of the panel, Nate Holdren. Nate is a legal historian of capitalism and is a professor at Drake University. He is the author of the book Injury-Impoverished Workplace Accidents, Capitalism and Law in the Progressive Era, and he's back today to talk about two recent things that he wrote. The first was for Spectre Journal, and it was called Hands Off, Don't Fall for the Democrats or Their Legalism. And the second one is in an independent Iowa-based newspaper called Little Village and is called Deportation is Wrong, Period. Nate, welcome back to the Death Panel. It's so great to have you on the show again, my friend.
Thank you for having me. It's really a delight to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation because these two pieces that you wrote, one, your letter arguing that deportation is categorically immoral, which is the piece for Little Village, and then your analysis of the so-called hands-off mobilizations that were happening earlier in the summer for Spectre, I think are doing something kind of unusually clear in a moment when so much of the discourse is really scrambled or reactive and sort of distributed or almost resigned, depending on where you're looking and who's doing the analysis. And I think even though they were written at different times in different contexts and responding to different events, though obviously the events are connected and related, there's a really important shared analytic thread running through them that feels really urgent to pull on. And I'm excited to talk about that together today. Now, part of the reason I wanted to bring these pieces into dialogue here is that they challenge some of the most entrenched habits of American political common sense, right? Habits that frankly shape not just the center or the right, but even large parts of the left. And both essays really insist that legality is not morality, that the state's claim to legitimacy does not make its violence any less violent, and that movements lose their bearings when they let the law set the horizon of their political imagination. And that's a theme that I think comes up constantly on the show. It's a big theme of your work, how law functions ideologically, how it manufactures the appearance of neutrality, and how much work we have to do to denormalize the violence that it really quietly enables. So the deportation piece in Little Village makes that argument through the most concrete and sort of intimate terrain, which is the state's power to tear people from their homes, families, communities, and lives. And you write with a kind of moral clarity that really refuses negotiation on the topic of ICE kidnappings, insisting that deportation is an injustice not because of the details of any individual case, but because the practice itself is an act of state violence that no bureaucracy can sort of sanitize and no person's quote unquote legal status justifies. You connect this to a historical arc from slavery to segregation to bans on interracial marriage to the death penalty. And the kind of through line is that the law has always been perfectly willing to consecrate brutality, often with a straight face and legal check marks. And then in the hands-off essay from June in Spectre Journal, you zoom out into the kind of broader political moment. You take apart the very liberal fixation on lawlessness of the Trump administration as the kind of central critique of the second Trump era. And you show how hollow that frame is and how easily it folds back into the kind of bipartisan law and order consensus that was a big problem during the Biden administration as well. And how that kind of leaves movements in a disadvantaged position, right? How it confuses procedural correctness for legitimate or substantive justice of any kind. And you show that this fixation isn't neutral. It's counterinsurgent. It actively blunts political struggle. And it makes our demands smaller, our coalitions weaker, and our strategies always from the point of running defense, right? It invites the Democratic Party also back into the role of some kind of moral arbiter, even when the party is also fully aligned with the very same machinery of state violence that we're talking about here. So for me, the reason to talk about these pieces together isn't just that they're obviously thematically related. I think it's strategic too. Both of these essays really push us to think about what movements are doing intentionally or not when they let law define the terrain of struggle or define what justice looks like. They invite us to think about how solidarity can get distorted when we start litigating who deserves protection and who doesn't, or drawing those lines in the sand. And I think you raise difficult but really necessary questions about how we talk about injustice, not just in movement language, but also in our day-to-day lives, right? Like how we organize against it, yes, but how we also just speak about it to each other, and that obviously affects how we sort of stay oriented towards a future that isn't just slightly less violent than the present, but an actual sort of horizon of liberation. So I think that's exactly the conversation that we need now, which really is refusing the kind of false stability or false safety of legal common sense and appeals to legal common sense, and instead asking essentially what would it look like to build a politics grounded in actual justice, solidarity, and most importantly, a refusal to make peace with the everyday violence of the state, no matter who's in power. So let's open up there. Can you walk us through the core arguments of these two essays, Nate, and just talk about, for folks who haven't had a chance to read them, how you see them speaking to each other, both in terms of like the moment you were responding to and the moment you were writing them in, and also the larger sort of political or ethical intervention that you're trying to make and that we're kind of making today by holding them up together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all that, B. I really appreciate it. There were a number of times when you were summarizing and paraphrasing things I said. I wished I'd put them that way myself. So I really appreciate that. I guess I will say, at the outset, a lot of my stuff in the moment feels like I'm just kind of throwing coins in a wishing well, and in a real state, like I'm sad and angry, and it's like I have to put this feeling somewhere, and I don't know what it'll add up to. So I work kind of intuitively and in ways that make me anxious, because I want everything to be analytical and clear, and I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's not actually how I work most of the time. And so I'm delighted to hear that for you, there was a coherence in the two. I also think, generally speaking, a lot of the time we are operating in the world with sets of political intuitions and kind of moral sensibilities and gut feelings that arise from lots of sources, not only from kind of reputable, formal, respectable sources like books, right? But like from many, many sources. And we're continually trying to integrate them and we live in the world in ways that are not always clear, I think. And also those are shaped by different life experiences and context. So like I'm 47, I'm partly a product of the tail end of the anti-globalization movement and then the anti-war movement of the early aughts. And I was relatively politically formed prior to Occupy. And so then I saw that come about, and that was not a formative experience for me in the same way it was for some other folks. And then the 20 teens, there are a host of experiences, right, which have been very new. But one of the things that has been a longstanding confusion and source of frustration for me is that the world and the left has gone in directions that I thought were just sort of concluded. And there are, I think, a lot of people like that. I mean, everybody who's on the left is unhappy with the world in important respects. But both of these pieces were partly me trying to make sense of, there are people who have sensibilities that come from a good place. People want the world to be better, but their vision of that, their political imagination, I like how you put that, the horizon of their political imagination is very, very different. And so that's one, and just trying to articulate that and say, look, the faith that people have in the law is gonna break their hearts eventually, and also a lot of people are gonna get hurt really badly in the meantime if there's not more effective political strategies devised. And then the flip side of that, I think there are quite a few people who are developing reservations or wondering if maybe things they've been led to believe aren't true, and there seem to be very few voices validating that. And I'm just a guy in central Iowa, but to the degree, but I've had my life changed by lots of people who are just people, in flyover states myself. So to the degree that I can write a thing that somebody's going to go, hey, I felt that, but didn't have words for it, like that was sort of the part of the hope. And so with the Spectre piece in particular, I was seeing, and still am seeing, lots of people going, this thing's happening and it's illegal, as if that's the objection. Mm-hmm. or as if that's consequential. Because like the implication is, like, for some of the time anyways, like if we can just get the right institutional actors to notice the illegality, then they'll rein in the Trump administration. And like, that's a really understandable political imagination, but it's just false. And I have a friend who I like very, very much personally, and I like his work a lot, named Rob Knox. And he's written a couple things about I cite them in the piece about the anti-war movement in the UK and about opposition to the Tories in the late 2010s in the UK. And he makes this point of like that sensibility of like leaning on the law just didn't work. And even more so, perniciously, it felt for a little while like it was working when it wasn't. And that sort of locked people into that strategy. And so I had this inchoate sense of being out of step with a lot of the left, a lot of dominant left political sensibility, the sense that there are actually quite a few of us who feel that way, but we're disorganized and we're sort of less than the sum of our parts. And that sense of being out of step is really painful if you think you're the only one, especially. And so I wanted to write this piece to say, hey, here's another perspective. The law is in fact not on our side. The fact that it's illegal is irrelevant. So I'm, just as an example, personally, I'm from a mixed race family, and for a long time, mixed race marriages were illegal. I don't give a shit. Like that's so much the worse for the law. Like the law can't be the arbiter of our moral sensibilities or what we do or don't want politically, because that's whether it's legal or not is a strategic consideration at most, not something that shapes whether we think it's right or not. And there are quite a few people who seem to be using illegality to mean that's objectionable, or
bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is like, one, not a very powerful objection, in fact. And two, as I tried to say in the piece, actually kind of a dangerous objection, because lots of really important things are illegal. And like, that's the state denying people those important things. And so if we're going to denounce the Trump administration for illegality, well, there aren't a lot of legal actors who are going to actually rein in the Trump administration, certainly not to the degree that we would want them to. And if we're going to shore up the power of that's illegal as a thing that people go, oh, shit, if it's illegal, we have to stop it. Well, that's a very double-edged sword that's going to cut as many regular people doing important, necessary things as it's going to cut powerful actors. And then the other thing I'll say on the first part of why that's a bad criticism also is that implicitly hands power to a set of institutional actors, and it frames us as clients or audience members, when what really needs to happen is that large numbers of us get organized and form practices of popular power or institutions of popular power. So this was especially upsetting when the hands-off protests were coming and then No Kings was coming, of like lots and lots of people gathering together, sort of going, we want to be the passive audience and clients for someone who's going to take this up. Like there's this sort of I don't think anyone thinks that exactly, but there's just the logic of it is sort of, we're doing this because the institutions aren't working. But once the institutions start working again, we won't have to do this anymore. And there's that famous sign, and I don't want to dunk on this person because I'm sure they mean well, but there's this famous sign of like, if Kamala had won, we'd all be at brunch. And like, that's sort of the role of these institutions, or one of the roles of legal institutions and of state mechanisms of official institutions of dispute resolution, partly exist so people will leave it to the experts to work out and buy something, go shop, go work, stay home, be home alone too, right? Don't be in a public space where you're deliberating politically, right? Don't be at a protest. I have a dear old friend who used to say, we get socialized into a sensibility of when in doubt, look up. And I think that's sort of what this expresses, is this, oh no, things are bad, I'll look up for the right kind of expert who will solve it for me. And that's a very understandable sensibility. And I'm not criticizing people for getting socialized into that ambient sensibility in our society, but it's one that's an obstacle and we have to break out of it. So that was kind of what I wanted this piece to do, with some empirical detail about what's happening right now. And I think the Democratic Party, even its best wings, are all of a piece with that sensibility of like, hey, let's get to a situation where you can defer to the institutions. No need for popular power, no need for mobilization, except in exceptional circumstances. Let's get to where you can all go back home, kind of thing. And even folks who mean really well. And I think I think that's of limited use in opposing the Trump administration, because I think the most effective forms of opposition are going to be fairly socially disruptive. And I think it's of especially limited use in building for the long term, because Trump is not going to be president forever. And if opposition to Trump stops with reelecting Democrats and then we get nothing for it, that's like a tragedy in lots and lots of ways. Squandered time and energy and money, also And as we've talked about before in past, we've talked about social murder. There's a literal body count to that. Like when popular mobilization misses and the left misses opportunities and so on, and that just will happen sometimes. That's unavoidable. But like there are people literally die. Like that's not, I don't mean that metaphorically. Like there was just a thing I saw, and this is not news to us, but and probably all your listeners know this, but it was a reminder. The UK, if they had implemented their lockdown protocols like a week or two earlier, 23,000 people would have 23,000 lives would have been saved, right? So like there are like real stakes when we leave things to institutions instead of when movements force things to move faster. So that was what I was trying to argue with this Spectre piece of like essentially laying out in a smarter and more organized way what I've said here, like don't trust the law. The law is not in fact on our side. Don't trust the voices of the law. Don't trust the voices of civility and peacefulness. We need to be much more independent in our judgment and independent in our mobilizations collectively. And also, just to underscore the two Rob Knox pieces that I cite, I think are really, really good on this. And I think of this piece as essentially me taking an empirical account of what's happening right now, plus those two pieces by Rob, and then adding my, insistence on the moral outrage of it. And I also think that, we're not oversupplied with critical resources for this moment. I think we're oversupplied with encouragement to be optimistic about the capacity of of a political program that passes through official institutions to win. And I think that we're undersupplied with materials that makes us see the limits of those institutions and that encourages us to, only look to ourselves and a little more autonomy of the working class and of kind of popular mobilization and to be a little more distrustful, frankly, of kind of analyses from on high. So that was sort of what I was trying to do in this piece. Should we move into the Little Village one?
Yeah, sure.
So this piece comes from a similar sensibility. Spectre, that I wrote the hands-off piece for, is a Marxist journal. Mm-hmm. And so the people who read it generally know what they're in for to some degree. So there's sort of an issues of audience and what I can and can't assume. Little Village is an arts paper that's a free monthly. I live, as I said, I live in central Iowa. I've been here about 10 years. I'm a lifelong Midwesterner. I have grown to love Iowa. I moved here for work, but now I'm really into it. And Little Village is, I would call it, fiercely loyal to the Iowa arts. And it's not primarily officially high status arts, but much more popular arts. So like bands and, community theater and like local kinds of stuff that doesn't get much respect. And they are very, very loyal to that. And I love that. And, as we all know, that stuff is not commercially viable, generally speaking, which means people are doing that because they have a set of values that are not fully subordinated to a mindset of everything has to be commercially viable. So there's a lot of counterculture stuff that moves in those circles. And so it's not an accident that Little Village is very politically progressive in its editorial line and in the kinds of things it runs. It's run a number of really good stories criticizing the Iowa Republicans who control all three branches of government here. And I've written a couple different letters to the editor to them in the past too, partly just as a way to put some of the outrage, and also we're not oversupplied with critical voices in Iowa saying, "Hey, fellow Iowans, you're right about this." So what the immediate precipitating event was that the superintendent of Iowa schools was arrested by, I don't know if it's ICE or Border Patrol, but I'll just say ICE. He was arrested by border cops, and the allegation is that there's some irregularity in his status and maybe he didn't do the paperwork correctly or whatever. And he's a respected figure. I mean, I'm not generally someone who's like, hey, school principals, superintendents of school districts, they're the good guys. Like, I was a punk as a kid. And like, if anything, I'm like, they're management. But like, he's like a pillar of respectable Iowa, and he gets taken into custody. And so that was really shocking. And Des Moines is a fairly progressive place, certainly for Iowa. The dominant political culture of the state, certainly the people in charge, is very right wing. Des Moines is not really like that. There are pockets of much further left sensibility in Des Moines. And so I was seeing lots of people responding to this, being shocked, being very upset on his behalf. And this is also in the context of what ICE is doing around the country. But I was noticing official voices saying things like, oh, we really need to get to the bottom of his immigration status. And in the context I just described, where the state is fairly right, the dominant culture of the state is fairly right wing, and we're in this pocket that sees itself as out of step with that. Those kinds of official voices were the same kinds of voices I was criticizing in the hands-off piece, though I honestly didn't really think of it that way at the time that I wrote it. Those official voices have extra power because they're like, oh, there's some of the good politicians, they're on our side. And in a situation where it feels like everybody in power is a monster, a handful of officially recognized voices saying the right thing, that can feel really good and really validating, and perniciously so. Like that's why we've all seen movies and TV shows where police do the good cop, bad cop routine. The reason the good cop works is because people in that situation are desperate for any kind of humane treatment and any kind of recognition and validation. And that is how I think these progressive voices that are going, oh, wow, I shouldn't deport him unless he deserves it, right? Like that's the good cop routine. And I was seeing stuff on social media by people who clearly meant well, clearly had their hearts in the right place, and whose, I think, first impulses were in line with, I think where you and I are on this, but they were like confused by the messages of these other people they respect. And they're like, yeah, well, I guess we should figure out what his status is. And so I wanted my piece to just be like, fuck all that. You're right. Trust your gut. And because it's an arts magazine, and it has a different readership, I didn't get into any of the Marxist stuff. And I appealed to Martin Luther King Jr. for a kind of ideological backdrop or ideological foundation to stand on in a way that in another setting, I would have said, our solidaristic commitments to socialism and so on. But that's just, there's space constraints, and I'm speaking to the audience. But what I tried to say in that piece is basically, look, all of us who are watching resistance to ICE around the country or participating in it, for those who are, our gut level sensibility is that we don't really give a shit about the person's documentation. We don't see that as legitimate. These are cops harming our friends, our neighbors, our family, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And since they are being allowed to do that, some of us are going to try to stop them. And that is the correct position and a smart position. And people who think that way should trust their gut and go with that. And people who say things like, oh, well, let's make sure the documents are in order. Hey, let's get to the bottom of this. Hey, let's have the lawyer look into it. That is a step back, a step to the right, a step down. That's worse than the sensibility that people are displaying in all those mobilizations and in our opposition. And so I wanted to sort of try to draw that dividing line. And again, to just say, trust your gut. And, I draw the parallel to capital punishment, and I don't argue the case. Like if someone is pro capital punishment, then the piece isn't going to move them, and they're just not my audience. Those of us who are opposed to capital punishment, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of us, deportation is like capital punishment. We're just against it, period. And so I tried to say that really directly. And I also got into the 1850s and opposition to slavery. And some of this is that I'm a historian, and it's just an occupational hazard of being a historian that you think the past is immediately relevant in that way. I do think that, though, and I think the 1850s particularly are a clarifying decade. And I think that it's very clarifying to think in the present with, because if you take claims made about what to do about Trump and his actions in response to Gaza or his actions in response to deportation, and you transpose that into the 1850s, it's very, very clarifying, because pretty much all of us in the United States in 2025 have a clear sense that slavery was wrong and it needed to be gotten rid of as fast as possible, even if there were really high consequences in terms of social disruption for that. And that's, in my view, that's a very widespread moral sensibility. People who don't have that moral sensibility, I'm just not in dialogue with them. I don't care to speak to them. And so for those of us who think that way, and I will also say that the fact, what I just said, I'm right about that. I can't prove it. I don't have numbers or whatever, but I'm right about that. The fact that that is the case is itself wildly improbable from the perspective of someone in 1850. Like if you got into a time machine and said, hey, abolitionists, direct action focused abolitionists, in 175 years, your view will be the baseline view of the majority of Americans. They'd be like, that seems unlikely, but God works in mysterious ways. And so I think that's also really important for us in the present to know, is that those of us who are sidelined voices, voices of subordinated views, voices of views that are very radical and sometimes get laughed out of rooms, we should be aware that all of the important moral progress and social progress that happens in the history of the world are stories of what were treated as wingnut views eventually becoming the majority consensus over long processes of struggle.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.